The Business on RTE Radio 1 with Bank of Ireland. As Ireland's enterprise bank, we're lending to over 500 businesses and farmers every week. RTE Radio 1.
Welcome back to The Business. You can contact us by text to 51551, by phone to 1850 715 150, email thebusiness@rte.ie or tweet @thebusinessrte. Well, a lot of attention was paid this week to the Dunnes Stores workers' strike. Staff there were complaining about their precarious contracts. Some workers are only guaranteed 15 hours a week, although in many cases they may end up working more. In the UK, 0-hour contracts have been very prevalent in the news also. Earlier we spoke to Professor Guy Standing from the University of London, and he's coined a term for the growing number of people from all backgrounds and professions who find their working lives ever more precarious. He's called them the Precariat. And we asked him to set out his stall.
Well, you have to put it into context, but basically the old idea of the working class, the proletariat, is a 20th century thing and it's gone. And we're in the painful stage of being in the middle of a global transformation in which a global market system is emerging. And what we've been witnessing is a period dominated by neoliberal economics, which has pursued policies of labour market flexibility, opening up markets to the world and so on. And this has created a profoundly different labour process, a labour market than has ever existed in the past. And if I can give you just one key factor that's very important in explaining what's happened with the precariat, it is that within the last 25 years or so, the global labour supply has quadrupled. In other words, there is an extra 2 billion souls who are participating in the global labour market, and all the extra people that have come onto the labour market have been habituated and resigned to living standards 1/50th of what an Irish worker would have accepted 20 years ago, or what a British worker would have accepted. And in the process, a new class structure is emerging with a plutocracy. It's not the top 1%, it's the top 0.001%. Global citizens of disgustingly wealthy power and strength striding the globe. Underneath is what we had expected to be the majority by this stage of the 21st century, which is what I call a salariat. People who have employment security, long-term, full-time jobs, pensions, paid holidays, paid this, paid that. That is a shrinking proportion of the total these days. It's a minority. It won't disappear, but it's a minority. And a long way below that, as the proletariat disappeared, the old full-time, stable, manual jobs that are disappearing, is this precariat. And the precariat consists of people exposed to being pressurized to accept a life of unstable labour, all these new forms of casualization and subcontracting and interns and 0-hour contracts and all of these things that now the newspapers are discussing.
Insofar as this idea of the precariat might replace the old idea of the proletariat, it's the proletariat were the sort of working classes, but as you describe it, you could be someone who's a qualified architect and be in the precariat. In other words, you could be from a traditional, what would have been a middle-class background or a middle-class profession, or from a traditional working-class background or profession, and find yourself in this new category.
That's right. I mean, within occupational groups, you take an architecture, for example, or you could take medicine. What has happened is that an enormous proportion of the total within those occupational groups are now part of the precariat. And they also find that they have to rely almost entirely on money wages. And they don't get access to non-wage benefits. They're losing access to pensions and paid holidays and paid maternity leave and all these things that were built up in the 20th century. And they don't get access to rights-based state benefits. And what's happened that really hurts the precariat is that they face enormous poverty traps.
If you look at it, Guy, and if increased trade and globalisation has brought 2 billion more people into the global workforce. You can't say it's all bad, because firstly, it's good for those 2 billion people that they're in that workforce as opposed to not being in it at all. And the other thing is that if this new class of precariat individuals have come along and find themselves in that situation, who's to blame? Because can you automatically say that their employers and the corporations are to blame? Because of globalization, the corporations are constantly having to compete with other corporations that might just as easily move the jobs out of Europe altogether.
I fully appreciate your point of view, and I think that it's predominantly correct. I don't think it's a matter of attributing blame or trying to call employers rapacious and all this sort of nonsense. I think it's a structural change that's taken place, and you can encapsulate that by saying that the 20th century income distribution system as such has broken down. When I was learning economics at Cambridge, we had a law of economics which was that over time the share of national income going to capital and the share going to labour, the shares were roughly stable. Okay? Since globalization's taken off, the share going to capital has been shooting up all over the world, and the share going to labour has been shooting down. Real wages in Ireland or in Great Britain or in any part of Europe or the United States will not rise by much in the near future. And
that's actually a very
reality.
That's a very grim assessment, isn't it? Because of the extra 2 billion workforce that's out there, with technology and robots coming down the track in manufacturing, there could be even fewer jobs and more people looking for those fewer jobs.
Well, you've raised 2 points there. I don't think it's necessarily a grim or depressing prospect. It's a reality. And I don't think we can be like King Canute trying to hold back the waves of globalization, and that I think is ridiculous. I think one has to face up to the structural changes that are taking place and say, look, globalization will continue. We're not going to stop that, but we need to address the maldistribution of income and assets and various other things that affect the precariat, like the lack of any security that people are facing and the lack of any control of their time. These are different issues from the past, and we don't need to have a system in which the top tiny proportion of the world is taking more and more of the total income. That is not necessary. It doesn't actually benefit growth. It doesn't help with development. It leads to all sorts of negative social and economic consequences. I think we've got to be far more imaginative about how we can make sure that efficiency and growth and dynamism is not affected, while we recognize too that we cannot have a society in which a huge growing number of people are in the precariat because they're getting very angry.
In relation to the precariat, and as you describe them as a cross-section of society that's there now, traditionally, wouldn't trade unions have represented many of those people? And what do you think of the role of trade unions now? Are they not doing that job or performing that function?
I'm afraid not. I mean, I've always been a supporter of trade unions in the sense we need collective bodies to represent us, otherwise we're always going to be vulnerable. I think they've been unnecessarily and unfairly demonized and criticized in the last 25 years or so. But I think the unions have to reinvent themselves. They don't appeal to the precariat. I get invited all over the place to speak to precariat groups, and I always say that to others that if I want to clear the room and get people rushing for the bar, then I start talking about the trade unions. There is a disconnect there, and I think that the unions have to understand the particular challenges faced by people in the precariat. And one way of looking at it is to say that whereas the old proletariat saw the prime enemy as the employer, Today, within the precariat, that is often not the case at all. I mean, they often realise that they'll have a different employer one day to the next, and that's the primary problem. The problem are the intermediaries, the labour brokers, the employment agencies, the government agencies that are treating them shabbily.